Hello everyone, it's Mr. Nobody. I'm going to be doing something a little simple today, and I'm not going to use any editing, I'm just going to use in-camera editing, so forgive me if I have to stop and start it a little bit, but there's just something I wanted to do, and I want to read to you some passages from one of my favorite books, and it's one that I took my capstone course in when I was an undergraduate, and of course it's a pretty well-known book, but that actually a lot of people haven't taken the time to really read through. It's old, of course, and that is Milton's Paradise Lost. This is my complete and unabridged with the illustrations from Gustave Doré, which is a fun copy, but not super easy to find anymore. Doré did these wonderful woodcuts of all sorts of scenes, and they're wonderful in their complexity. They tell a story. He illustrated a lot of classic books. One of the things that I really like about them as you go through the book is how he shows the sort of changes, because you have someone like Satan, you know, everyone knows about Satan in Paradise Lost, and when he falls, he's beautiful, he's wearing armor, and then as time goes on, him and the other angels start to lose their armor, and this is Satan greeting the other fallen angels when they've fallen into the pit. And over time, you just see things changing, and that's one of the things I really liked about it, is you see the progression in Satan himself as he gradually loses some of his weapons, his armor. He still remains beautiful, more beautiful than the others around him. The higher up the fallen angels are in the hierarchy, the more impressive and powerful are, the more they retain the outward signs of beauty, so that even at the end, Satan still is very attractive and impressive, but he does start to change, so that you see over time, things are getting a bit worse for him. And you see him, that was him experiencing pain for the first time, and bit by bit, you see so many of them losing their clothes, and at the very end, they just become a mass of hissing monsters. And this is the famous one that's on the cover. This is Satan sitting, and just his hand on his chin, listening to Adam and Eve, and thinking. And it's also wonderful because, and we'll get to that passage, it's great the attitude he captures of Satan, of just like, I can't believe I'm listening to this. And on one hand, he kind of likes them. On the other hand, he kind of hates them. There's some great, very intimate drawings, too, of Adam and Eve hanging out in the garden. Lots of good personality to those drawings. So if you can't get a hold of an illustrated edition, that's not a huge deal. It's just a fun book to read, and it's much more expensive to find it. But there are some great scenes in it. It's amazing what you can do with some wood carvings. This is another classic one, you know, very classical in its, you know, way of doing things. You see Eve more than Adam. She's got a lot of personality in this. So does Satan. There's a whole lot of carvings of Satan. It's a lot of fun. It's a fun book. The illustrations are great if you can get them. But this is what most people have. This is the more common version that's pretty cheap. The Norton Critical Edition contains lots of essays and things that they'll have you get in school. And I'll also say there is a book that if you're going to read Paradise Lost, I actually recommend getting, and it's by C.S. Lewis, the popular author of the Chronicles of Narnia. He actually wrote a preface to Paradise Lost, and I read that, I think, when I was in high school. It's just really good. It helps you think about the characters. It helps you understand the perspective of John Milton, too. And it's by a person who writes fiction and is actually good at writing fiction, and also writes those sort of stories, because C.S. Lewis, in his own way, has written these Paradise Lost type stories with his own The Magician's Nephew. So he has, I think, some really good insights into it. And having been in a class with people who studied Milton, people say the stupidest things about him. I was in a class where we read a passage, and the teacher's like, "What do you think about this?" And one of the students was like, "I don't think he's really saying this. I feel like he's setting this up, and then this is what people think, and he's really making a parody of it with this position and sort of mocking it by imitating it." The teacher, and you rarely ever see this in a college class, the teacher, especially with seniors, she said, "No, that's wrong. Milton was the first person to say this. This is the articulation. This is the original articulation of this position. He's the first one. This isn't some later looking backward parody that you would do hundreds of years after the fact. This is the original." So it's good to kind of get inside his head and trying to understand it. He's very well educated. One problem with Paradise Lost is there's so many layers to it that he'll reference a story, and if you don't know like the entire canon of Greek and Roman literature, you won't quite know what he means, because it's like, oh yeah, if you know what that myth is, and you understand who those characters are and what happened to them, then this one sentence suddenly means a whole lot more. But if you don't have that, it's still a fun book. You know, there's always bits that people skip through. People tend to like Satan the most. A lot of that is just because I feel like we see ourselves in him. And it's a bit like the Screwtape Letters, which C.S. Lewis also wrote, where he said, you know, it's easy to write the villains because we already contain all of that. You know, like you can find it in yourself as an author. Writing villains is easy, and it's easy to just let your own heart and mind loose and say what you're really thinking deep down. And let it go crazy, and use that to basically create your villains. It's very easy for you to be worse than you are, but it's actually very hard to be better than you are, or to imagine what you would be like to be better than you are. And so, to some degree, a writer is limited in how well he can write good characters by his own greatness. But you do not face the same limitation with evil characters, because it's very easy to find your own depravity. And so I'm just going to read just a few of my favorite passages from this book, and a lot of them will be speeches by Satan, because he's got quite the character arc in this. It's a very tragic character arc. You're really watching a battle of ideas. If you think of the demons and spirits and Satan, it's like, what are they? They're the powers and principalities. You know, that's how they... And they're personified so that we can see them, we can understand them. They're alive in their own way, in the way that ideas seem to be alive, and they capture people, and they possess you, they take you over, they can infect you. And so they're personified so we can understand them more in these more human terms, in a way where we can read a story about it. But a good way to think about it is Satan is a spirit. You know, he is the spirit of this arc of brilliance that just gets horribly twisted and becomes vengeful, and all the great ideas and how badly they can go wrong. And so that's you see that in this book, where the different fallen angels, they're spirits, and in many cases they're powerful spirits. They're ideas or a spirit. They're sort of it's not easy to describe, but you know, there are these powers and principalities. There are meanings and purposes and value structures. And some of them are great. They're amazing. But then they start to think they're everything. And that's what causes them to become this terrible monsters, is they won't be organized under a higher unifying reality or logos. And that's God. And God saying, you are all wonderful, powerful entities, but all must be united and brought together under one logos, and that is my son, that is Jesus. And then Satan rebels against that. And he's just like, no, I individually as what I am. And in some ways, he does represent reason, ambition, the best things of humanity. You know, creativity, passion. He's a reflection in many ways of the greatest powers and abilities that humans have, but you see this reluctance in him to be organized under anything greater than himself. But then that's exactly what he tries to do to everyone else. And he, in fact, subverts a third of heaven to bring them under himself. And he's really actually very selfish. So in a way, he's a freedom fighter, but he's also a horrible, manipulative tyrant who deep down is like, well, if I can't be everything, I'm going to take everyone and everything I can down with me. There's a great speech to that effect, which we'll get to in a minute. So to begin with, Satan is fallen, and he's turning and he's looking around. There's a great story because it starts in the middle of the action, in media res, and you find Satan falling, laying vanquished, and rolling around and trying to reorganize himself after having lost the war in heaven, and then saying, what are we supposed to do? And then bit by bit, it goes into flashbacks. It's structured very much, in some ways, like a modern movie in that sense. It has some great narrative tricks to it. So he looks around and he sees his right-hand man. He sees Beelzebub, and he speaks to him. And he says, if thou beest he, but oh, how fallen, how changed from him who in the happy realms of light, clothed with transcendent brightness, did outshine myriads, though bright. If he whom mutual league, united thoughts and counsels, and equal hope and hazard in the glorious enterprise, joined with me once, now misery hath joined in equal ruin. Into what pit thou seest, from what height fallen, so much the stronger proved he with his thunder. Until then, who knew the force of those dire arms? Yet not for these, nor for what the potent victor in his rage can else inflict, do I repent or change. Though changed in outward luster, that fixed mine and high disdain, from sense of injured merit, that with the mightiest raised me to contend, and to the fierce contention brought along innumerable force of spirits armed, that durst dislike his reign, and me preferring, his utmost power with adverse power opposed, in dubious battle on the plains of heaven, and shook his throne. What though the field be lost? All is not lost. The unconquerable will and study of revenge, immortal hate and courage, never to submit or yield, and what is else not to be overcome? That glory shall his wrath, never shall his wrath or might extort from me, to bow and sue for grace with suppliant knee, and deify his power, who from the terror of this arm so late doubted his empire. That were low indeed. That were an ignominy and shame beneath this downfall, since by fate the strength of gods in this imperial substance cannot fail, since through experience of this great event, in arms not worse, in foresight much advanced, we may with more successful hope resolve to wage, by force or guile, eternal war, irreconcilable to our grand foe, who now triumphs in excess of joy, sole reigning holds the tyranny of heaven. So that's Satan lamenting his fall, obviously. He's saying, we knew God was strong. They preferred me. Wouldn't they rather have me as God? I want to be God. And I didn't know he was actually that strong. And it seems to come as a surprise. And he's not being completely honest about the situation. You know, he's trying to put a good face on it. And the big thing that he's saying is, I've been beaten, but nothing can make me apologize or recognize his God's sovereignty, even though his power has proved superior. So he's basically saying, well, God won because he was stronger, but we deserve to win, and he can't make me say that I'm wrong about that. So it's a great. It's a great speech, and he also talks about, he's like, well, why did it prove that Jesus was supreme? Why did God read to supreme? And he says, you know, and this is actually another quote, he says, we put to proof his high supremacy, whether upheld by strength or chance or fate. And so that's a sense in which he's asking, why does the universe have to be the way it is? Is it just that God happens to be the one in power? Like he's just the political holder of power at the moment? And he says, or is it just chance? Is it just an accident of history that God is in charge? And these are the things we ask about the world in general. You know, why is the world the way it is? Why are some things the way they are? Why do we have to bow to them? Why is the world, is it necessary? Is it contingent? So much of the order of the universe. And so he's saying, well, we're gonna test it. We're gonna see if it's just chance. We're gonna see if it's fate. You know, fate can't be changed, chance can be changed, strength is just arbitrary oppression, it can be overthrown. So Satan said, we wanted to find out. And then I'll just give you a little more of one of Satan's speeches where he's like, hey, hell's actually pretty great. So he says, it's this the region, this the soil, the clime, said then the lost archangel, this the seat that we must change for heaven, this mournful gloom for that celestial light. Be it so. since he who is now sovereign can dispose and bid what shall be right. Farthest from him is best, whom reason hath equalled, force hath made supreme above his equals. Farewell, happy fields, where joy forever dwells. Hail, horrors! Hail, infernal world, and thou profoundest hell! Receive thy new possessor, one who brings a mind not to be changed by place or time. The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. What matter where, if I still be the same, and what I should be, all but less than he whom thunder hath made greater? Here at least we shall be free. The Almighty hath not built here for his envy, will not drive us hence. Here we may reign secure, and in my choice to reign is worth ambition, though in hell. Better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven. But wherefore let we then our faithful friends, the associates and co-partners of our loss, lie thus astonished on the oblivious pool, and call them not to share with us their part in this unhappy mansion, or once more with rallied arms to try what may be yet regained in heaven, or what more lost in hell. So that's probably one of the most famous lines. That's the better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. That is very much his idea. He would sacrifice everything. He would sacrifice the whole world, beauty, companionship, anything. Really, absolutely anything. As long as he has to be something less than the ruler. And so that's his bargain that he's made with the universe, that he's made with God, which is like, I would rather have myself and be ruler of myself and lose everything than be something less than everything. And that very much is, people like C.S. Lewis would say, that is like the sort of dictum of hell, that that would sacrifice anything. And that's the sort of spirit that it's like, well, you can't really keep them out of hell, because hell is the only thing they'll be happy with. And there's a sense in which hell is the perfect place made for Satan, because it's where he can have the one thing he demands, which is that he be everything. But in the sort of world we live in, where a particular thing just isn't everything, including ourselves, it means, well, then you have to sacrifice everything else. And it's also worth mentioning that Satan is clearly a political activist and a sort of social constructionist, because he very much makes the point about God that he's happy to be away from him, because reason, him who reason hath equalled. He's saying, by reason, by my own arguments, I see myself as equal to God, but force has made him supreme. So we're just as good as God. I'm as good as God, which also means I can make a world as good as him, so I don't need him. And so that's very much Satan's argument, is he's like, God's sovereignty is arbitrary. It is the result of force and imposition. There's no internal justification for it. Of course, there's so many passages that I couldn't read them all, but there is another one that I want to read, and it's from Book 2. I'm going to skip past some other things that I really like to get something from Book 2, and it's actually where Satan is arguing basically that the quality of misery in hell that comes from every person being God is preferable to the hierarchy of heaven, where all things are organized under this grand unifying principle. And this passage is a little harder to follow, but this is where he's trying to explain why he basically, and he says this literally while sitting on a throne that he's had his his minions make for him. And so he sits on a giant throne delivering a speech about how wonderful the equality and peace of hell is. And so he says, that he's their leader by free choice. And he says, you established a safe, unenvied throne yielded with full consent. The happier state in heaven, which follows dignity, might draw envy from each inferior. I'll go back and explain that. But who here will envy whom the highest place exposes? Foremost to stand against the thunderer's arm, your bulwark, and condemns to greatest share of endless pain. Where there is no good for which to strive, no strife can grow up there from faction. For none sure will claim in hell precedence, none whose portion is so small of present pain that with ambitious mind will covet more. With this advantage then to union, and firm faith and firm accord, more than there can be in heaven, we now return to claim our just inheritance of old, surer to prosper than prosperity could have assured us, and by what best way, whether of open war or covert guile, we now debate, who can advise may speak. And there's two interesting things in this. One is he's basically making the argument that everyone losing everything is better because then no one can envy anyone else. You know, they're all so resentful and envious and hateful of seeing anything greater than themselves that he says, in fact, it's far happier because in hell all have an equal share of nothing and an equal share of misery. And he reminds me a little bit of, he's sort of a brilliant sort of Stalinist dictator in that way. And like I said, he says this while sitting on a throne himself, that he's very much says, oh, I deserve this. And at the same time, he claims how happy and perfect his world is, but he can't actually be happy and perfect while the kingdom of heaven exists and while it remains uninjured. And so it's not like they can just sit in hell and actually be content. They have to go after anyone else who has something different, anyone else who would place themselves in the kingdom of heaven. And it's just like, what can we do to wreck that? What can we do to bring heaven down? But then, of course, they have the problem that they realize, well, technically nothing. We've been whipped once, and so they realize it's pointless trying to attack heaven again after they just got thrown out. So they say, well, maybe we can ruin things for other people and enlarge the kingdom of hell, which they make a lot of arguments for how wonderful it is. So we'll go on with some of that. Book 2 is really an interesting book because it's mostly a debate. It's a debate that Satan is managing. Belial has a lot to say. He's described as one of the fairest and most beautiful, that his tongue dropped manna, that he could just make anything sound wonderful, that he had the maturest counsels but low thoughts, and that he knew how to speak of things that were noble but were actually timorous and slothful, that he pleases the ear, and he basically says, why don't we just chill out, you know, and just stay out of God's view. And he just says, maybe if we just leave God alone, he'll kind of forget about us. And far removed from that, if his breath stir not their flames, our purer essence then will overcome their noxious vapor, or inured not feel, or changed at length into the place conformed in temperature and nature, will receive familiar the fierce heat and void of pain. This horror will grow mild, this darkness light. So you're just saying, time, we'll get used to hell. We'll just get used to it. This will be our reality. But that ends up not going so well. Mammon argues against him, and it goes back and forth. So here's what Mammon says back to that particular speech by Belial. He says, suppose he should relent and publish grace to all, on promise made of new subjection. With what eyes could we stand in his presence humble, and receive strict laws imposed, to celebrate his throne with warbled hymns, and to his godhead sing forced hallelujahs, while he lordly sits, our envied sovereign, and his altar breathes ambrosial orders and ambrosial flowers, our servile offerings. This must be our task, in heaven this our delight. How wearisome, eternity spent in worship, paid to whom we hate. Let us not then pursue by force impossible, by leave obtained unacceptable, though in heaven, our state of splendid vassalage, but rather seek our own good from ourselves, and from our own live to ourselves, though in this vast recess, free, and to none accountable, preferring hard liberty before the easy yoke of servile pomp. And so his argument basically, and it's funny, he basically argues, he's a clever one. He says, we can overcome this with technology. He says, there's this passage here, he says, as he, our darkness, can we his light not imitate when we please? This desert soil wants not her hidden luster, gems and gold, nor want we skill or art from whence to raise magnificence, and what can heaven show more? And he basically says, we can just build this place to be whatever we want. He's a big believer in the power of his industry and cleverness, which he really has. One of the things that the fallen angels actually do during the war in heaven is they make war machines. That's an interesting thing. They actually build like heavenly artillery and use war machines instead of just fighting hand to hand. It's very, they technologically innovate. They're creative. But in the end, Satan basically says we need allies. And so they're like, we hear there's another creation, a different world, and why don't we go there? Maybe we can get allies. Or at least we can strike a blow and ruin something of God's and turn God against them and them against God and, make the situation more complex. And Satan ends up convincing everyone. He's the most brilliant, he's the most charismatic, so he wins the debate. And there's just one final thing I want to read from this section, and it's a reflection by Milton himself on the nature of human internal strife. And it's this. It says, "Oh, shame to men." And this is when all the demons have basically agreed with one another and said, all right, we'll all work together to try and ruin humanity. It says, "Oh, shame to men. Devil with devil damned firm concord holds. Men only disagree of creatures rational, though under hope of heavenly grace, and God proclaiming peace, yet live in hatred, enmity, and strife among themselves, and levy cruel wars, wasting the earth, each other to destroy, as if, which might induce us to accord, men had not hellish foes enough besides, that day and night for his destruction wait." Which is, just some remarking on the tendency of humans, even when you have people of a common cause, and you even have cause and common enemies, often we're destroyed by our internal struggles with one another. And it's like, doesn't mankind have enemies enough that we must find them within one another? I'm not going to say much about Book 3 very quickly. It's more discussion, God and the Son, and talking about what's going to happen, because if God actually knows what's going to happen. And there's a lot of talk about free will and predestination, and a lot of that's more theological. But there is one little passage that I particularly like in there, which is actually God speaking, where he says, and this is in regard to humanity. He's speaking of humanity, where someone's basically asking, can't you just stop it? And God's argument is basically to take away man's freedom is to unmake what I have made him. And that is to do him harm, and God refuses to do man harm. So this is what he says. He says, "I formed them free, and free they must remain, till they enthrall themselves. I else must change their nature, and revoke the high decree, unchangeable, eternal, which ordained them freedom. They themselves ordained their fall." So he's saying the argument in this section is basically like the fall itself isn't the fault of God just because he created freedom. Freedom is a good. God creates it. God has eternally ordained it. God sustains it. And he actually gives people ultimately what they want, in the same sense of what Satan wants is a world where he is the ultimate, where he is everything, and there is nothing that he has to be under. Then the place is found and given to him that gives him what he wants. And unfortunately, it isn't actually heaven. It actually is hell, just by necessity. That's the only place he can actually have the thing he wants, and God won't revoke his freedom to say he can't have it. But I like that. He's like, I form them free, and free they must remain till they enthrall themselves. So there's a sense, and this is something some people have talked about, there's a sense in which freedom ultimately has to be used, and you decide to what to enslave yourself. And there's a sense in which it has to be given. It's something that can't just be kept, because if you just keep it, then it goes nowhere. It becomes nothing. Your freedom is a freedom to choose. It is to choose to say, I will organize my value, my effort, my thought under this. And it's just saying you have the freedom to choose what that is going to be. What is going to be the organizing principle? What is going to be that to which you wager your life on. And Satan wages his life on being the ultimate thing in the universe. And that just doesn't work out that great for him. But you're free until you choose to enthrall yourself. But in the end, there's a sense in which you're free until you choose to be enthralled. And in the end, you will. The question is, what will you choose to enthrall yourself to? What will be the object of it? Okay, I'm going to read a longer passage, one of my favorite passages from Book 4, when Satan has arrived on Earth to start doing his work. And there's just a very short bit I want to introduce it with, that he says he turns his thoughts towards the work he has to do, so to try and distract himself from thinking too much about what's going on. To distract himself from his troubled thoughts, and from the bottom stir the hell within him. For within him hell he brings, and round about him, nor from hell one step no more than from himself can fly. And that's something C.S. Lewis talks about. I think it's in The Great Divorce. He says, even if you could take souls like Satan out of hell, you couldn't take the hell out of Satan. Even in heaven, he would bring all hell with him, because hell is a place that is internal, not external. And the only sense in which it is external is in having its desires be realized in their necessary unfolding. Anyway, so this is when he sits and he's looking around, and he sighs and he starts reflecting. And this is a long one, so try to stick with me. O thou that with surpassing glory crowned, lookest from thy sole dominion like the God of this new world, at whose sight all the stars hide their diminished heads, to thee I call, but with no friendly voice, and add thy name, O Sun, to tell thee how I hate thy beams, that bring to my remembrance from what state I fell, how glorious once above thy sphere, till pride and worse ambitious threw me down, warring in heaven against heaven's matchless king. Ah, wherefore, you can see Satan starting to actually, now that he's away from everyone else, he's speaking with more candor. Ah, wherefore, he deserved no such return from me, whom he created what I was in that bright eminence, and with his good upbraided none. Nor was his service hard. What could be less than to afford him praise, the easiest recompense, and pay him thanks? How do? Yet all his good proved ill in me, and wrought but malice. Lifted up so high I disdained subjection, and thought one step higher would set me highest, and in a moment quit the debt immense of endless gratitude, so burdensome still paying, still to owe, forgetful what from him I still received, and understood not that a grateful mind by owing owes not, but still pays, at once indebted and discharged. What burden then? Oh, had his powerful destiny ordained me some inferior angel, I had stood then happy, no unbounded hope had raised ambition. Yet why not some other power as great might have aspired, and me through mean drawn to his part? But other powers as great fell not, but stand unshaken, from within or from without to all temptations armed. Hadst thou the same free will and power to stand? Thou hadst. Whom hast thou then, or what to accuse, but heaven's free love dealt equally to all? By then his love accursed, since love or hate to me alike it deals eternal woe. Nay, cursed be thou, since against his thy will chose freely what it now so justly rues. Me miserable, which way shall I fly? Infinite wrath and infinite despair? Which way I fly is hell, myself is hell. And in the lowest deep, a lower deep still threatening to devour me opens wide, to which the hell I suffer seems a heaven. Oh, then at last relent. Is there no place left for repentance, none for pardon left? None left but by submission? And that word disdain forbids me, and my dread of shame among the spirits beneath, whom I seduced with other promises and other vaunts than to submit, boasting that I could subdue the omnipotent. Ay me, they little know how dearly I abide that boast so vain, under what torments inwardly I groan, while they adore me on the throne of hell, with diadem and scepter high advanced. The lower still I fall, only supreme in misery, such joy ambition finds. But say I could repent, and could obtain by act of grace my former state, how soon would height recall high thoughts? How soon unsay what feigned submission swore? Ease would recount sorry, losing myself, vows made in vain, as violent and void. For never can true reconcilement grow where wounds of deadly hate have pierced so deep, which would but lead me to a worse relapse and heavier fall. So should I purchase dear short intermission, bought with double smart. This knows my punisher, therefore as far from granting he, as far I from begging peace. All hope excluded thus, behold instead of us outcast, exiled his new delight, mankind created, and for him this world. So farewell hope, and with hope farewell fear, farewell remorse. All good to me is lost, evil be thou my good. By thee at least divided empire with heaven's king I hold. By thee and more than half perhaps will reign, as man ere long and this new world shall know. And that's Satan's great speech, where he basically admits that he's not very happy about how things went, and then he actually does have regret for it, and that he's keeping up appearances for his followers. And then talks himself into just saying, well, there's no point in doing anything else. He's like, did I do it freely? Yeah, because others who could have fallen didn't. And he says, well, maybe it's God's fault for making me so high and powerful. And he's like, but then if he hadn't, maybe I would have been suckered by some guy just like me, you know, someone else. And then he says, well, even if he was to accept me back, it would just make me want to betray him again. So he's just like, that's fine. Instead, I'm just going to dedicate myself forever to enmity and revenge. And then Satan actually sees humans, and that's very interesting what his first reaction to them is, because his first reaction is not hatred, it's love, and the fact that it's love is what actually makes his hatred grow the greater. He says, "Oh, hell! What do mine eyes with grief behold? Into our room of bliss thus high advanced, creatures of other mold, earth-born perhaps, not spirits, yet to heavenly spirits bright little inferior, whom my thoughts pursue with wonder, and could love, so lively shines in them divine resemblance, and such grace the hand that formed them on their shape hath poured. Ah, gentle pair, ye little think how nigh your change approaches, when all these delights will vanish, and deliver ye to woe, more woe, the more your taste is now of joy." And I'm just going to continue that passage because it's a great passage. Happy, but for so happy, ill-secured, long to continue. And this high seat your heaven, ill-fenced for heaven to keep out. Such a foe as now is entered. Yet no purposed foe to you, whom I could pity thus forlorn, though I unpitied. League with you I seek, and mutual amity so strait, so close, that I with you must dwell, or you with me henceforth. My dwelling haply may not please, like this fair paradise, your sense, yet such accept your Maker's work. He gave it me, which I as freely give. Hell shall unfold to entertain you to her widest gates, and send forth all her kings. There will be room, not like these narrow limits, to receive your numerous offspring, if no better place. Thank him who puts me loath to this revenge, on you who wrong me not, for him who wronged. Which is just such an interesting passage. He has an almost devouring love, a hunger for the companionship of humanity, a desire for them to share and join him in his vengeance and his misery. He says, you must dwell with me or I must dwell with you. It's a great passage. And I just want to remind you really quick, there is a particular passage showing Satan sitting like this. with Adam and Eve in the background. And if you're wondering what Satan's thinking, this is the passage that I think Dore used to inspire that particular one. It's where he's watching Adam and Eve together. He says, and very sumptuous descriptions that Milton uses. On our first father, half her swelling breast naked met his, under the flowing gold of her loose tresses hid. He in delight both of her beauty and submissive charms smiled with superior love. So they're lying together and they're just happy. They're sitting there, and it says they're kissing with kisses pure. Aside the devil turned for envy. That's where you can't keep looking at them because he's just like, oh, gag me. Yet with jealous leer malign, eyed them askance. That's this look. He can't help but look back. And to himself thus plained, sight hateful, sight tormenting. Thus these two imparadised in one another's arms, the happier Eden, shall enjoy their fill of bliss on bliss, while I to hell am thrust, where neither joy nor love, but fierce desire, among our other torments not the least, still unfulfilled with pain of longing pines. So he says the greater Eden that Adam and Eve inhabit is actually each other. That's the greatest Eden that they inhabit is one another. And Satan hates that because one of his greatest torments is unfulfilled desire. And now I just want to read a passage, one of my favorite passages, and it's from book 4, and it's basically the sex scene in this book, and Milton does include one, and he actually argues for why he includes a sex scene, and this is like 400 years ago. And this is, he puts in, it's not his only one, but this is the one that hits you up front. And Milton feels like he has to actually justify it, and it's totally understandable that he does. And so he makes a very good argument for it, and it reminds me also of a lot of arguments that took place back in the old days, Middle Ages, things like that, about books like Song of Solomon, which if you really read it is very sexually explicit and has a lot to say. It's rich, it's steamy, it's dripping with wonderful metaphors and poetic language. And people argued, and some people said, I remember there was, I forget who it was, there's one bishop, I feel like he's one of the bishops from Africa, and he was like, yeah, some people don't know what to make of the Song of Solomon, and he's like, and some people have said, should we take it out of the Bible? Because it, especially if little kids are going to be reading it. Not that was much of an issue there because it was before the printing press. And he just said, God forbid. He's like, I would rather see the skies fall than to take the beauty of that book out of the Bible. He saw it as part of the great richness of the story that was imparted. And that to take it out would be blasphemous. This is one of the great gifts of one of the greatest writers of the Old Testament to Christians. And so he thought the very suggestion of doing such a thing was blasphemous, and that it was one of the greatest beautiful gifts, that book. And because that book is about one of the greatest, most beautiful gifts given to humans, which is the joy of one another. And so Milton has his little sex scene in here. And so they decide to go to bed. And it said, this said unanimous, and other rites observing none, but adoration pure, which God likes best, into their inmost bower handed they went, and eased the putting off these troublesome disguises which we wear. Straight side by side were laid, nor turned, I ween, Adam from his fair spouse, nor Eve the rites mysterious of connubial love refused. Whatever hypocrites austerely talk of purity and place and innocence, defaming as impure what God declares pure, and commands to some, leaves free to all. Our Maker bids increase. Who bids us abstain but our destroyer, foe to God and man? Hail wedded love, mysterious law, true source of human offspring, sole propriety in paradise of all things common else. By thee adulterous lust was driven from men among the bestial herds to range. And I'll just pause for a moment. So that's almost like a evolutionary statement. He's saying marriage, this institution that organizes mere reproduction under the system of higher purposes of society, loyalty, honor to God, honor to the people. You know, he's saying that has taken this sort of disorganized mere perpetuation of sex that you see in the animal world, which often involves making millions of children just to have one or two survive, and is often violent. And, you know, he's saying there's this higher organizing principle that humans can understand and humans can embrace that is a gift to them from God. And it's marriage, and it brings this beauty and this organization, this connection through all levels of being, of humanity. Anyway, among the bestial herd strange, by thee founded in reason, loyal, just, and pure, relations dear, and all the charities of father, son, and brother first were known. Far be it that I should write thee sin or blame, or think thee unbefitting holiest place, perpetual fountain of domestic sweets, whose bed is undefiled and chaste pronounced, present or past, as the saints and patriarchs used. Here love his golden shafts employs, here lights his constant lamp, and waves his purple wings, reigns here and revels, not in the bought smile of harlots, loveless, joyless, unendeared, casual fruition, nor in court amours, mixed dance or wanton mask, or midnight ball or serenade, which the starved lover sings to his proud fair, best quitted with disdain. These lulled by nightingales embracing slept, and on their naked limbs the flowery roof showered roses, which the morn repaired. Sleep on, blessed pair, and oh, yet happiest, if ye seek no happier state, and know to know no more. So that's very in keeping with the elevated view that a lot of Christians have actually had of sex. And it's interesting because you also see that in the puritanical tradition. They were actually extremely, they're very focused on contracts and on the sacredness of marriage. And it's because actually they thought it was so amazing. They thought it was such a big thing. They had such an elevated view of it. And a lot of your famous early Puritans wrote a lot of very passionate love letters to each other, and wrote immensely about it. And they had some funny things, actually. You could be sued if you weren't performing your marital duties for your wife. And that happened. There's been wives who took their husband to court and said, my husband isn't being faithful to me. My husband actually isn't having sex with me. And they believed you have a duty to have sex with your partner and also to actually please them. They thought that you needed to really, they thought those guys need to work hard and need to please those ladies. They had very strong protections for men and for women in that. They were very, very passionate about romantic love and could be very straightforward about it in their letters. And that's in keeping with the sort of Miltonian tradition, which also goes back to, some Augustinian. I mean, he had a lot of bad experiences as a youth, but I think you understand his negative view of sex is a negative view of the kind of sex that he had, which is, as Milton describes, like the casual encounters with the harlots, and also like he's saying also the fancy, at the other end of that, all the intrigues, all the court intrigues, and you're dancing around and nobody's actually getting anything from it. It's all just this crazy game. And he's like, that's totally not worth it. That's not where you get the real goods. And I think Augustine had that too, where a lot of what he disparages is his hatred and rejection of what his own youthful actions and experiences were, because he actually commends marriage immensely and thinks it's wonderful and thinks it's a great idea for everybody. But I really appreciate that Milton showed respect for books like Song of Solomon and makes a very impassioned defense in his book for like, I'm going to talk about them being naked. I'm going to talk about how they like each other naked. I'm going to talk about how they find each other attractive. They find each other wonderful. They want to kiss each other. They want to talk to each other. They want to stroke each other. These they're happy. They're not just living in some weird chaste paradise. Their chastity is more the Catholic idea of chastity, where sex, lots of sex within marriage actually counts as chastity, because the point is just using it for what it's meant to be used for, enjoying it in its sort of proper place. The idea is that so it can flower, so you can actually have tons of it, and so you can get the full benefits of it, and avoid the consequences of rash use of something that's incredibly powerful. And so he very much has that vision of marital chastity doesn't mean sexlessness, it actually means being wild for it and thinking it's wonderful. And so that's something that I really enjoy in Milton. And he uses that as an example, too, at the end of the book to show how things have changed. And that's why it's also very relevant. He wanted to include this sex scene because he wants to show you this perfect paradise that Adam and Eve find their greatest Eden in one another, and particularly in sex with each other. And it's this wonderful union, and then brings you back to it after the fall. And they're still in Eden, and they have sex with each other, and something has changed. It's not the same. Things are starting to go wrong, even though they haven't even changed their place yet. Something's gone wrong on the inside. So it's a good narrative structure because he's setting it up for how he's going to bring you back to it later. Now, of course, I could go on forever, but I could read for hours and hours. I have so many favorite passages marked. But I'm going to just close things out by following that particular line where one of the angels comes down and has some talks with Adam, and they actually talk about love and sex. And so he says, with honor thou mayst love thy mate, who sees when thou art seen least wise. So that's it's a great statement about marriage. It's a wonderful way to say what marriage is. Our mate is that who sees us when we are seen least wise. He says, but if the sense of touch whereby mankind is propagated seems such dear delight beyond all others, think the same vouchsafe to cattle and each beast, which would not be to them made common and divulged, if aught therein enjoyed were worthy to subdue the soul of man, or passion in him move. What higher in her society thou find'st attractive, human, rational, love still. In loving thou dost well, in passion not, wherein true love consists not. Love refines the thoughts, and heart enlarges, hath his seed in reason, and is judicious, is the scale by which to heavenly love thou mayst descend. Not sunk in carnal pleasure, for which cause among the beasts no mate for thee was found. So I'm going to try and unpack that passage. It's a very dense passage, and kind of complicated, because there's a whole theory of what humanity is and what sex is built into it. And he's basically, the angel's saying to Adam, you've been given sex, and the feeling of it can seem like the greatest thing in the entire world. The best thing, the ultimate thing, you know, the dearest delight beyond all other. And he's saying, okay, so is it just a touch? Can it exist just at the level of the animal? In which case you might even say, is it something that could just be shared like an animal or even with an animal? I mean, it doesn't quite go there, but you could take it that way. And the angel's argument there, I believe it's Raphael, is basically just like, there's too much to you. If you were just an animal, sure, but you aren't. There's so much to you. He just says, you also possess reason. You are this creature of many levels, you know, not passion only. You're not only a creature of passion. You're not only a creature with no understanding of the past or any vision for the future or the complexity of the world around you. And he's basically just saying, love has to contain all of you. Like, sex needs to involve and be organized in some sense under all of you. And so for him, he says, reason, judiciousness, by which he really just means the mind. The mind has to be part of it. And so he says, heavenly love, by which you ascend. And so he's saying it's not like sex is here and heavenly love is here and they're in some sense separate. He's saying you exist across all these planes, from mere physical reproduction down to the level of, some animals don't even clearly feel actual pleasure. They just do the reproduction, very simple animals, up to ones who really enjoy the feeling. And it's like you are up here. You have it connected to even higher and higher things. You've got so many levels in you. And the heavenly is the highest, the organized under the highest thing. And the mind and the reason can see that. And basically, your love needs to transcend through all those different levels. And he says, that's why Eve has to be your mate, because the only mate that is worthy of you has to be one who is your equal, someone who is also an object of reason. So, he says, basically your wife, or rather your sexual partner, cannot just be a carnal object. She has to be an object of your complete affections, your complete capabilities. Like, it's not enough to just think that someone or something is sexually attractive or that they can make you feel good. He says the true love for you is Eve, because Eve is the only thing great enough to be paired with what you are, and the only thing great enough for your love. So your object has to be an object of equal depth and complexity to yourself. And it's very much also an argument for saying love between men and women can't be founded merely on this physical, sexual level, because there's too much of you for it to only be that. And there's too much of them that you really need and should want and need to receive to limit yourself in that way. So it would both degrade you and it would degrade them. And so it's a simple passage, but it's articulating this very high up calling. So Adam actually speaks back to that, and he says, "To whom thus half abashed, Adam replied." And basically he's going to say, you're right, she is, I actually do think she's super hot. I think she's the hottest thing in the world, but you've got a really good point. And this is what he said: "Neither her outside form so fair, nor aught in procreation common to all kinds, though higher of the genial bed by far, and with mysterious reverence I deem." So he thinks she really is the hottest thing in the universe. "So much delights me, as those graceful acts, those thousand decencies that daily flow from all her words and actions, mixed with love, which declare unfeigned union of mind, or in us both one soul, harmony to behold in wedded pair, more grateful than harmonious sound to the ear." So you do get, in Milton, a lot of stuff that is very much of his time with men and women and what the situation is. And you also get this wonderful articulation, biblical articulation of Adam really loves Eve because of her, not just because she's attractive. And he sees that the goal of them is unfeigned union of mind and to be one soul. It is to take these two fractured halves of humanity and knit them back together into some vision of completeness. That to be one and alone is kind of static, and that it's in the combination of these two that differ that you actually get interaction and a kind of economy, and something that's actually alive. Because even if you just had one force, it would be one static force. But then you add a second one, and the two interact, and all of a sudden you have something that's dynamic, something that's pushing, pulling, moving, and truly alive. And so this wedded pair in harmony that is more beautiful than music. And music is often something we deeply connect to. It's where we see individual lines, individual purposes, but then they get organized in harmony under a larger structure and build to something bigger. And those things have little children and they bring in other things. It all becomes organized under this vast system, and it just touches something deep in us. And we love the way that it sounds. When things fit together, you know, when they create something greater in their interaction than they alone on their own can be. Okay, so we're going to jump ahead just to the fall. There's one other thing I want to bring up, and it's when Satan has to take some physical form. You know, he takes the form of the serpent, a sort of, you know, mythological symbol, something of fear for humans, sort of innate. And the interesting thing about it is Satan hates it. And I love that bit about it. He talks about it. He says, "O foul descent, that I who erst contended with gods to sit the highest, am now constrained into a beast and mixed with bestial slime. This essence to incarnate and imbrute, that to the height of deity aspired, but what will not ambition and revenge descend to?" And it's a very interesting thing, because Satan has a hatred of inhabiting the mortality in the flesh. He's so ambitious that to be constrained by even his physical being that he has to inhabit, it just disgusts him. And it's interesting because that is, you know, Satan in many ways is a way for looking at different instincts in ourselves too. And I think Milton is rejecting that, for one thing. There can be a hatred of our own animal natures, of our own, the meanness of the flesh, and to be disgusted with it, to hate it, to wish to cast it off, to aspire to godhood. Well, the fact that you have to eat and go to the bathroom and wriggle in the mud like we all do, that really demeans your godhood. It puts the lie to your own delusions of godhood. And so it's understandable why Satan hates it. And it's understandable why as a human we could hate it. It flies in the face of our own ambitions. Okay, so I'm going to skip ahead, like I said, to they've eaten the apple. Or, well, not the apple, you know, the fruit. And then they're talking, and they're just like, wow, that was pretty great, you know? And Adam is just like, you know what? You were right. This fruit's pretty awesome. And he says, and he just says, "From this delightful fruit, nor known till now true relish, tasting if such pleasure be in things to us forbidden, it might be wished for this one tree had been forbidden 10. So he's saying, oh boy, if forbidden things are so delicious, I wish more things had been forbidden so I could steal more of them. And so he's like, wow, it's inflaming my senses. So said he, and forbore not glance or toy of amorous intent, well understood of Eve, whose eye darted contagion fire. Her hand he seized, and to a shady bank, thick overhead with verdant roof embowered, he led her nothing loath. Flowers were the couch, pansies and violet and asphodel and hyacinth, earth's freshest, softest lap. There they their fill of love and love disport took largely, of their mutual guilt the seal, the solace of their sin, till dewy sleep oppressed them, wearied with their amorous play. Soon as the force of that fallacious fruit, that with exhilarating vapor bland about their spirits had played, and inmost powers made air, was now exhaled, and grosser sleep, bred of unkindly fumes, with conscious dreams encumbered, now had left them. So they fell asleep, and then they woke up. And the problem is that they had that morning after eyes. Consciousness returned. You know, the higher reason has returned to them. They indulged in a different kind of love, a love that was very much tied to the earth. It was not organized according to some higher principle. It was just passion and nothing else. The tasting of forbidden passions. And it's not like it's portrayed unpleasantly. It's just that you wake up in the morning. And it says, as they rose as from unrest, so they're not waking up refreshed. And each the other viewing soon found their eyes how opened, and their minds how darkened. Innocence that as a veil had shadowed them from knowing ill was gone. Just confidence and native righteousness and honor from about them, naked, left to guilty shame. He covered, but his robe uncovered more. And so that's the interesting thing. You know, they've gained shame. And like I said, at the beginning, he describes his wife, Eve was described, just your husband or wife is described as, you know, this one who sees you most clearly when you are at your most exposed, you know, the most revealed as a fleshy, imperfect thing. And at the time, that didn't bother them. They felt that revelation was fine. But now they are full of suspicion. They're seeing each other's flaws. They're aware of their own flaws. And all of a sudden, Adam's like, I kind of want to cover myself up now instead of just being visible. And he's trying to put something between them to mitigate that feeling of vulnerability that they now have because of their understanding of one another. And so then they both fall to bitter recriminations and accusations and blame and arguments, and they talk about suicide. They talk about all kinds of things. They do not have great options, great ideas. Neither of them acquits themselves brilliantly. It just becomes this big squabble of blame, and they have their first genuine fight. And like I said, it's a good scene because it echoes the earlier scene of their innocent love and shows how much things have changed for them and how differently they're approaching each other and how much they see their own vulnerability and how much they see the vulnerability of the other person and how much they each know that they see that, and what a problem it becomes between them when they suddenly realize, I can see things about you you wouldn't like to be seen, and I can hurt you in ways you wouldn't like to be hurt. I can see all your foolishness and all your vulnerabilities, and I can get you for it. And all of a sudden, they need to cover up. And so it's not just the physical nakedness is just a sign for really this deeper understanding of each other's vulnerabilities that now they're suddenly afraid of instead of able to trust one another with. And then just to sort of leap ahead to wrap things up, so God talks about why death is one of the consequences of it. And it's interesting because very similar to things that C.S. Lewis have said, where death is in a way is a cap on punishment. That's the argument. And even, C.S. Lewis argues that hell in its own way is basically like a tourniquet. It's a tourniquet for the natural pain that arises out of sin, that it places it within limits where it at least can't harm anything else and basically gets what it wants, although what it wants isn't what it thought it wanted. Anyway, so God is saying that, says, I at first with two fair gifts created man endowed, with happiness and immortality. That fondly lost, this other served but to eternize woe, till I provided death. So death becomes his final remedy. And so he's basically saying there was happiness and eternal life, but having given up fondly, having on purpose given up happiness to prolong woe eternally is actually to make a punishment eternal, and not just for you, but for everyone around you. And so in a way, death is this limit placed on things. And that also plays into this discussion because, like I said, they bring up suicide and discuss it, and Michael basically argues and tries to be like, hey, it's okay. God's here for you. Death is going to be a part of life, but, it's not the worst ill that can befall you, and so, he's saying this is, you live your life and eventually death is the chance to be done with the pain of life. And so Adam is like, well, henceforth I won't fly death, nor would prolong life much, but rather how I may be quit fairest and easiest of this cumbrous charge, which I must keep till my appointed day of rendering up, and patiently attend my dissolution. And so he's saying, ooh, I'm happy to die. And, there are some Christians who take the message and do say, oh, so death is good. By saying death isn't bad, they're like, oh, awesome. Well, how soon can I die? And Michael is just like, no. Because he's just finished arguing with him, don't love your life too much. And now Adam's kind of gone the other way. And Michael says, nor love thy life, nor hate, but what thou livest, live well. How long or short permit to heaven, and now prepare thee. And so his point is just like, it's not one thing or the other thing. It's about a balance. It's like, don't desperately cling to your life to prolong it forever such that you would never give it up or never spend it on anything worth spending on it, or would be, reluctant that it corrupts you in your refusal to accept that that is the lot of all humanity, to live and to die. And then Adam goes the other way, is like, all right, I'll be super happy to die. How soon can it happen? He's just like, no, that's not what you're supposed to do either. Please try to maintain some sort of balance. And then we're going to get to the kind of conclusion here, and it's after a lot of talking about history and all sorts of things, you get the counterpart thesis to the hell is a place within you that you bring with you. And it's basically the gospel argument that heaven becomes a place that you can take with you, and that you can walk through this world, this veil of shadows, and yet heaven be with you at all times. And so Adam is talking back to him, to Michael. And he says, how soon hath thy prediction, seer blessed, measured this transient world, the race of time, till time stands fixed. Beyond is all abyss, eternity, whose eye no end can reach. You're just looking at the vastness of the universe and time. Greatly instructed I shall hence depart, greatly in peace of thought, and have my fill of knowledge, what this vessel can contain, beyond which was my folly to aspire. So he's saying it's good to have all the knowledge that a human can have, and that he just sort of overshot what he could be, that he could be everything, that he could be Godhood, although he is an image of God. But he's saying he's learned to love the knowledge that was for the sort of thing that he is, which is still the greatest knowledge he could have. Anyway, he says, henceforth I learned that to obey is best, and love with fear the only God, to walk as in his presence, ever to observe his providence, and on him sole depend, merciful over all his works, with good still overcoming evil, and by small accomplishing great things, by things deemed weak subverting worldly strong, and worldly wise by simply meek, that suffering for truth's sake is fortitude to highest victory, and to the faithful death the gate of life. Taught this by his example, whom I now acknowledge, my Redeemer ever blessed. To whom thus also the angel last replied, this having learned, thou hast attained the sum of wisdom. Hope no higher, though all the stars thou knewest by name, and all the ethereal powers, all secrets of the deep, all nature's works, or works of God in heaven, air, earth, or sea, and all the riches of this world enjoyedst, and all did rule. One empire only add deeds to thy knowledge answerable. Add faith, add virtue, patience, temperance, add love. By name to come called charity, the soul of all of them. But by which they mean love. Charity means love in this context. The soul of all the rest. Then thou wilt not be loath to leave thy paradise, but shall possess a paradise within thee, happier far. So, like I said, that's the counter argument. He's just saying these are the great goods, much as Socrates said, what harm can be done to a man that possesses goodness? He possesses all things that are good within him. If he sticks to the goodness within his soul that can't be taken from him. And so you carry paradise within you. And so that's what makes it possible for Adam and Eve to actually walk out in the world and have courage. Because, of course, they're terrified. But it's like, well, what for the sort of mortal things we are, imperfect, making mistakes, regrets, arguments, so many problems that we have, what could give you the courage to actually walk out of paradise? And that's what the sort of end of the book about. And it's his faith and trust in God, and the understanding of the paradise that God can give him access to within through his Redeemer, that allows him to actually walk out into the terrifying parched soil of the world. And here's the final passage where, Adam and Eve are going to walk out through the gate, and Eve basically just says, I'm glad we're together. I'm glad that we're doing this together. And although, woe has come upon us, through me specifically, Eve says, all will be set right too. Which is, she's talking about Jesus, because they actually get some forewarning of things in this version of the story. Anyway, so spake our mother Eve, and Adam heard well pleased, but answered not. For now too nigh the archangel stood, and from the other hill to their fixed station, all in bright array the cherubim descended, on the ground gliding meteorous, as evening mist risen from a river o'er the marish glides, and gathers ground fast at the laborer's heel, homeward returning. High in front advanced, the brandished sword of God before them blazed, fierce as a comet, which with torrid heat and vapor as the Libyan air adust, began to parch that temperate clime, whereat in either hand the hastening angel caught our lingering parents, and to the eastern gate led them direct, and down the cliff as fast to the subjected plain, then disappeared. They, looking back, all the eastern side beheld of paradise, so late their happy seat, waved over by that flaming brand, the gate with dreadful faces thronged and fiery arms. Some natural tears they dropped, but wiped them soon. The world was all before them, where to choose their place of rest, and Providence their guide. They hand in hand, with wandering steps and slow, through Eden took their solitary way. And I love that final passage. It always moves me greatly, which you can probably tell. It's such a picture of life, cast out of this childhood paradise, this time of ease and innocence, and walking out into the world. And there's a heroism to it, and there's a sadness to it. It's the bittersweetness of life. It's captured very well. They shed tears, because even though they know that they're like, it's going to be okay in the end, they still shed some natural tears. They feel pain over what's happened. They feel fear, but they feel hope too. And it's this wonderful picture of the two of them just slowly walking out to find their way in the world, to make the world that will be. And I love that. I love that final line. And I'll read it one last time, because I love that so much. The world was all before them, where to choose their place of rest, and Providence their guide. They hand in hand, with wandering steps and slow, through Eden took their solitary way. I feel like this is just a wonderful picture. It's a wonderful picture of the human condition, too. And at this point, Adam and Eve are just like us. Before this, they're not just like us, but now you're seeing them, and they're in the same position as all of us. They're entering the heroic journey of mortal life that we all undergo. And the reason that passage speaks to us is because that's our story, walking out into the wilderness, facing these pains and difficulties of life, finding ways to face it with courage. Also the opportunity, choosing where to rest, having Providence as our guide, having these things to, God to guide us, our our understanding and inspiration and wisdom to guide us, trying to find this place of rest and hand in hand picking our slow way through the world. Anyway, so those are some of my favorite passages from Paradise Lost. I'm sure this is longer than you expected it to be. It's a long book. There's a lot in it. If you really want to, I feel like you can read the first few chapters and get a lot of the best stuff early on. You don't necessarily have to spend lots of time on the War in Heaven. There is some pretty fun stuff in the War in Heaven. There's some fun arguments and things, but I just didn't have time to spend on it. It's a very big and complex book. It's got a lot of stuff in it. And luckily there's introduction to every book that tells you what exactly happens in that chapter. And so you can even look at it and be like, okay, I got it, and go on to the next chapter. Anyway, those are some selections from Paradise Lost. I hope you enjoyed it.